Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the re-presentation of the panel that I gave at Gateway Fate on You Mean to Tell Me That's a Real Fish? Um, Before we do get started, and I know most of you are probably sitting in front of a giant screen, but if you want to bring this slide deck up for yourself, um, don't skip ahead. But if you want to bring it up, and follow along on your own computer instead of watching my stream, that is perfectly fine, especially if you need a screen reader or something like that. You are welcome to use that. So if you want to, that's a QR code. You can just bring up your phone, do that, or screenshot it. I don't know how that actually works. I left it in just to see what would happen. Yes, I brought this over. So for those of you who are also watching this on YouTube, I am currently streaming this to my Twitch channel. So there will be some chat involvement. If you are going to be watching this in the future, hello, just leave any questions or comments you have down below, and I'll get to them whenever they come up in the future. That's specifically for that one person who will find this panel in like 3 years and ask a really obscure question, which happens. Okay. So before we get started, for those of you who may not know who I am, maybe you're just joining in because you saw it and you thought it was kind of interesting. My name is Fruity Snacks. I am also lovingly known as That Fish Guy from Twitter. I'm also the founder of the Eorzean Aquarium on Crystal and the Eorzean Museum Network. And on top of that all, I make guides on how to catch all the many various fish in Final Fantasy XIV on my YouTube channel, which is probably where you will be watching this in the future. And I also have a book at A Fisher's Guide to Eorzea.card.co, I think, or something like that. It'll all be linked down below in the future. So anyways, I wanted to get started off with this quote that I use quite often, which is Final Fantasy XIV is a fantasy game grounded in reality. And this quote came from Kate Swinar at the NA Fan Fest in 2023 and is actually said by one of the developers, but I couldn't catch who the actual developer was. So I'm giving this to Kate. I'm giving the quote to Kate, but just know that there's somebody else there. But the main thing is that Final Fantasy XIV is a fantasy game, and it is grounded in reality. And this is especially true. Why is my thing broken here all of a sudden? Hold on. There we go. This is especially true with the fish. We really look at fish from a very realism standpoint, and part of that is fishing in Final Fantasy XIV is basically a simulation. I'm not going to get super deep into this. If I might have something else on this later, on my channel at some point, but I'm not going to get really, really deep into this. But before we really dive into fishing, you need to know that it is one of the most realistic fishing games on the market, even down to the individual fish having different personalities, the different water types, salt, freshwater, brackish, time of day affecting the fish, the weather affecting the fish, the type of bait and tackle you're using affecting the fish, and how you are fishing. This is all realistic. I am a fisher in real life as well, and I can tell you that based on how a fish is, like how it feels when after it bites my line, its personality, I can usually tell like, oh, it's a chub or it's a trout or it's a catfish. Depending on the water that I'm in, I know what type of fish I'm going to be getting. Depending on the time of day, usually if you want to go catch trout, you usually go out early in the morning. But if you want to catch catfish, you can catch these fish at basically any time of the day, but they seem to prefer like the evening, specifically for catfish, like dusk. And we see that a lot with fishing in Final Fantasy XIV, where they have these time requirements, and that's usually how that mimics a lot of how the real world works. Weather, too, I actually learned this year when I was out fishing that it's better to go fishing for trout in small rivers or streams during light rain, because the rain will fall onto the trees and onto the ground, and it'll start washing bugs and like seeds and stuff that that trout love to eat, and it'll just knock it into the river, so they're more likely to be eating. And on top of that, with bait and tackle, depending on the type of bait and tackle you use, you're going to catch certain fish. So basically, I just want you to all understand that fishing is very realistic compared to the rest of the game. There is a lot of like hand wavy, woo, it's dynamis, and we might touch on that a little bit later, but for the most part, it's realistic. And this carries on into the world itself as well. We see a lot of mirroring between zones in Final Fantasy XIV and the real world. They all pull on these real life inspirations. For example, the Shroud is typically accepted roughly as not just like generic forest, but specifically pulling a lot from the German Black Forest. And the Azim Steppe is very, well, I was going to say very clearly, but it is almost no surprise that it is based on the Mongolian steppe, even down to the culture of the people in the Azim Steppe versus the Mongolian steppe. And we'll talk about the culture relationship in a little bit. And on top of that, it even gets down into some of the more like niche things. So in Dawn Trail, and I will add that there will be no Dawn Trail spoilers. This is the only thing that I'm going to be showing, and it is, in my opinion, the most unspoileristic thing that I could find on for Dawn Trail. But it's a very good example of, here we have Urkopacha, and this is a part of Urkopacha where there's a large salt flat. And on the right, Urkopacha was typically considered to be based around, Peru and Bolivia. And on the right, we have the Salineros de Maras, which is the salt ponds of Maras, Peru. Very similar in style, very similar in structure and like the culture around that area. And with these zones, we also get the same type of fish. Typically if you can find the real life equivalent of a zone, you will find that the fish almost exactly mirror it, with a couple of exceptions. But for the most part, you see this big parallel between like the Black Forest, very heavy in trout, pike, and a lot of generic freshwater fish like pickerel and bass. So like that is a pike from the Black Forest. For some odd reason, my notes say brown trout. That is not a brown trout. On the right, in the upper right, we have grayling, which is a fish typically found in the Mongolian steppe. And there are a lot of grayling-like fish and basically grayling fish and like skipperfish in the Mongolian steppe. And then the bottom guy here is a ghost knife fish, and it is found in Peru. And you can actually catch this guy in one of the fishing holes in Urkopacha. That's why I picked him, because it's like a carbon copy. But the one little concession that I make is that this is more of a non-Andes fish, which Urkopacha is kind of more based on like the mountainous region of Peru and like the Andes. This guy is not really found in the Andes, so a little bit of a concession there, but still it is a Peruvian fish. The one thing I also wanted to point out, that I pointed out during the actual panel, that I thought was kind of funny, was when I was trying to find example like species of fish in each of these zones, it was extremely difficult to not find trout. Like, I swear, every single part of this world has a trout in it. I mean, I'm like, oh yeah, Mongolia, like that's got to have some cool fish. No, it's trout. Black Forest, it's trout. Peru, Peruvian trout. And so there's trout everywhere. I just wanted to make that as a bit of a side note. These are some more semi-unique species. Knife fish aren't exclusively found in Peru. Graylings aren't exclusively found in Mongolia. Like these species are all over the world, especially pike. But these are just kind of like standout ones as well, that I just wanted to point out. But the main point is the zones match the real world, and the fish in those zones match the real world fish from those regions that they match. So that's like a level of detail that we typically don't see in video games. I have a bit of a weird metric too, where I'll judge a quality of a video game based on how accurate the fish are to the environment that they're in. So Final Fantasy XIV passes with flying colors. So now that hopefully everyone now is established, like, yes, fruity, okay, I get it. Every, real world fish are like the zones, they all match everything. There's this parallel, there's a ton of parallels. Yes, okay, everyone's nodding. Then, cool. Let's move on to actually talking about weird fish. And I want to do this in a bit of a fun way, and we're going to play a little game called Is This Final Fantasy XIV Fish Based on a Real Life Fish? And what I would like everyone to do in chat, if you are comfortable doing, just say yes or no when I show you the fish. And so we're going to start off really, really easy. Is the magic bucket based on a real life fish? I'm seeing a bunch of people say, is it based on a real life fish? And they're all saying yes. Okay. People who were at Gateway Fate were way better at this than you are. Technically, Magic Bucket is not based on a real life fish, but it is in fact based on a large 2-gallon metal bucket tin with a wooden handle for gift baskets, ice, drink, and candy. And you can purchase a 3-pack on Amazon for $27. I will not have a link to that in the description. This is not an ad for Amazon. Okay, next one. Cupfish. This guy is caught in the Blind Iron Mines in Lenosha in a cave, deep underwater. Everyone is saying yes, and you are technically correct. It is based on the blobfish. And this is what he is obviously based on, him and Drunkfish, which is the other blobfish that we have in game. This is what he's actually based on. However, that is not actually what he looks like. The cupfish is actually based on, while it is visually based on this is what the fish actually looks like, which is the blob sculpin. And this is a very deep water fish. And by deep water, I mean deep water. There's a variety of different zones in the ocean, and I won't go too deep into those, but there's like the top zone, I believe is like the sunlight zone. And then you have the twilight zone and the midnight zone, and then you have the abyssal zone down way at the bottom. Like those are the 4 big ones that I know off the top of my head. And that's one of the ways that we categorize the depth of the oceans, and it's based on the amount of light that actually comes into the oceans at certain levels. Well, the blob sculpin is really deep, and so it's a bit darker, and while you're that deep, you also have to deal with pressure. And so if say at the surface there's 1 atmosphere of pressure, if you're down where the blob sculpin is, there may be, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 atmospheres worth of pressure. And so these guys have to really withstand a ton of pressure. I think the example and joke that I made when I was at Gateway Fate was, think about the amount of pressure that you had on in college and like add a 0, and that's how much pressure these guys are under. And if you understand the very basic law of physics, which is for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, then if there is 6 atmospheres of pressure pushing on the outside of this guy, and pushing inwards to try and smoosh him, the fact that he isn't smooshed means that there's at least 6 atmospheres of pressure being exerted outwards by the body. And so that's cool, and that's how they can stay at this equilibrium. Well, if you take a blob sculpin out of the 6 atmospheres, this is one of the ones where this is not every fish adapts this way, but this is one of the fish where it can't really adapt to changing pressure very well. And so if you take that 6 atmospheres of pressure on the outside pushing in away, it still is going to keep pushing outwards. and that's why you end up with a bit of this guy. It's so quite literally and grossly explodes whenever he comes up to, if ever brought up to the surface. So if you typically won't see these guys in aquariums because we can't really replicate deep water aquariums that well. So cupfish is basically the blob sculpin, one of the very fun fish that you can actually catch. Okay, next fish, the space bishop. Is this based on a real life fish? And if you are around, if you've hung around me, you know the answer to this. Okay, I'm seeing a bunch of people saying yes, no, but kind of, but also I have no idea. Maybe. If you're not sure, that's the correct answer. Space bishops are based on something called Jenny Hanivers. These are technically skates. Now, so skates are a type of, the easiest way to describe them is that they look like rays. And the way that these work, the way that these are created is that it's not natural that for this fish to look like this. But what will happen is back in the, I believe it was like 17th, 18th century or so, 17th century, people would catch these skates and then they would mummify them, effectively just dry them out and form them into the shapes of demons and, believe it or not, dragons. That was one of the weird things. I don't see how this is a dragon. This is more demonic to me. But a dragon is something that they would use. And for the most part, what they would use these for is to give to tourists or to sell, or in some regions, they would actually use them as religious idols to use as part of whatever rituals they were using. They're really weird. I thought this was kind of cool as heck, though, when I found this out, when I was doing some research back in Endwalker on some of the fish that were being discovered. So you can even see some of the features of like the rays here on the side. And I realize my cursor's been in the middle here this whole time. You can see the rays and the tails and stuff, and how that all kind of matches out. It's weird as heck, but that is what they are in fact based off of. And even says this too in the description. They make a hint towards Jenny Hanivers. Description of space bishop in the guide. Okay, next question. Don't freak out on me here. Problematicus. This is the largest fish in the game. It is caught in a volcano in the middle of the Dravanian Forelands in Halo. Is Problematicus based on a real life fish? I'm seeing a lot of people saying yes, a couple of people saying no, a couple of people saying sort of. That's been kind of the running theme here. It sounds like it's a really kind of old dinosaur fish, you'd think. And a lot of people are stating, yeah, fish don't live in magma. That is true. We typically assume that that's not the case, but also I don't think we've ever sent a camera underneath the magma, so who knows? But technically, Problematicus is based on Leedsichthys problematicus. This was one of the largest, if not the largest, bony fish, and it is extinct. There is a large handful of fish in Final Fantasy XIV that are based on extinct fish. Problematicus is one of them, despite the fact that it looks like a whale shark, which is what a lot of people suspected that it was based on originally due to the large mouth and its size. Most people thought that it would be like an overly large basking shark or or the whale shark. It is in fact actually based on Leedsichthys problematicus, and these guys were old and prehistoric, and there's actually even a better version of it now. If you go to Garliichthys, which is in Endwalker, it actually looks closer to what Leedsichthys actually looks like, and they're both technically still, both it and Problematicus are still technically actually Leedsichthys. I don't know if this is showing up on stream. Is there an image on the right-hand side for everybody? Or is it white? Because I think my thing is just broken a little bit. Okay, cool. So it's just my end. That's mildly annoying. So anyways, there's on top of Lezichthyus, there is a ton of, like I mentioned, ton of other prehistoric fish that you can catch in game. Xenocanthus, Ziphicanthus, Opabenia anomalocaris, Snowy Paraxis. Paraxis is actually is actually a historic fish, or a historically extinct fish. Basically anything that ends with a canthus, with the exception of Coelacanthus, at least coelacanth. If you see that, or you look at it and go, man, that looks like a fish that is trying to figure out what a fish actually is, it was probably based on a real life fish at some point. I think even Drepanapsis, or the newly added in Endwalker, All Right, which was based on Sacabombaptis, those were jawless fish. Those were both ancient and extinct fish. As someone is pointing out in the chat here, yes, there is a fish bank based on Dunkleosteus as well. That would be Vicejaw, caught in off of the Bismarck in Shadowbringers, and Furkawada, as well as another one. Okay, my screen's jittery, so I'm going to be looking at my Streamlabs here to make sure this is right. All right, let's talk. Is EBE 9318/852738. There's a small and a big version of this, or as I lovingly call the EBE big number, or the EBs as some people call them. Is it based on a real life fish? I'm seeing some people already saying yes. And if you are saying yes, you are correct. If I can, there we go. It is in fact based on Crostata milsae. These guys live in the midnight zone, which I was mentioning a little bit earlier, anywhere between 3,300 to 13,000 feet deep, which is very deep. Tons and tons of pressure, like I was mentioning beforehand. But this is one of those jellyfish that that you would find just floating around in the middle of the ocean. They just kind of float around and they grab whatever they can. This came from I think it was Monterey Bay Research Institute video. They have a cool video on that. If you have the slide deck open, you can look in the notes for that video on this slide. So this is one of those really cool fish, and this was one of those fish that whenever a new fish gets added, or like at least at the beginning of an expansion, we always like to see, which new species are they bringing in? And this was one of the ones that for a while I believed we thought it would be like a Medusa jellyfish, and then we ended up with that. We got a video and someone was like, no, it's Crostata milsae, or milsae, however you want to pronounce that. So that is one of those fish that you kind of look at and you're like, there's no way. And then he's like, oh wait, actually it is. And a lot of Ultima Thule is filled with deep sea fish. One of the things that Kate mentioned during the FanFest panel was that they had ran out of fish facts, which is an interesting concept that they highlighted that whenever they add a new species of fish, the first of that new species that is added has a guide based around a real life fact of that fish. So just kind of a highlight of like, hey, they do in fact actually use real life fish facts in game, just further supporting that claim that, Final Fantasy XIV is a fantasy game grounded in reality. And they said for Ultima Thule that they had ran out of fish facts, which I found kind of strange, because even though there is, as of recording this right now, this is right before patch 7.1, there is 1,707 fish in the guide alone, plus probably another couple hundred between the diadem and quests and allied societies. Every single one of them has like a story and a description and a little bit of a fact, and it's like, there's way more species here that we can. So I really think they just haven't hit the biomes yet, correct? Like enough of those biomes to start bringing in some new stuff. Because we haven't even hit like the Arctic fish yet, and those are absolutely wild. So moving on, I promise we're going to go into something a little more cool here after this with Maru crab. Is Maru crab based on a real life fish? I'm seeing a lot of people saying yes, but also technically crabs aren't fish. Um, sure, we're using the Final Fantasy definition of fish here, but yes, Maru crab is in fact based on a real life creature called a Yeti crab. Now, Yeti crabs, their scientific name is Kiwa hirsuta, which I remember that. We're going to come back to that in a minute. They're actually usually referred to as furry lobsters, but they are actually more closely related to crabs. So the crab name actually makes sense. And the setae, which is the weird like hair that you see, the furry part of the crab, is technically not actually fur. It is a bit more chitinous, and it helps, and it is used to help clean out toxic materials around the hydrothermal vents by housing a bunch of bacteria, and which enables something called chemosynthesis, which is hugely interesting to scientists because it is one of those few cases in nature where we have those like how like the mechanism for it is just really interesting, that a lot of people want to know and understand how it works. And it's a bit, they get a little interesting too. Like I mentioned, they are around hydrothermal vents. So on the left here we have, I believe these are the hairy-chested Yeti crabs, because they have the hair, but it's on like they're like beneath them, so hairy chest. I believe that is what these guys are, and it's the same one in the lower right. Uh, they're not big either, but they just live on top of these hydrothermal vents. They live in these massive like piles of just crabs. I jokingly just call them like cuddle piles of crabs along these hydrothermal vents, and they just filter out all the food that they need, and they grab what they need, and they do everything there, and they just live within the hydrothermal vent, classifying them as extremophiles. And in the upper right hand corner, you can actually see there's a variety of different Yeti crabs. These are all different ones. You'll see the hairy chested one there on labeled E. A couple of other ones too that I don't know the name of. I also don't know why A is missing two legs. But just there's a lot of different variety of these, but we only got like that one specific one. So if they wanted to add more Yeti crabs, they totally could. But it's also just really interesting too about this being a deep sea creature and a hydrothermal vent. And if you know where you catch it, which is around the Caliban Gap, and you know what the Tempest was, at least before the Warrior of Light showed up, it makes sense that there's a fish there. So the Tempest isn't really based on a region, sort of, but it is, but kind of not really. But it is based on the ocean floor, and so a lot of the fish that you find there are, I believe the term is pelagic. I believe pelagic is on the ocean floor. Basically ocean floor dwelling fish. So there's a lot of like goosefish, stargazers, and like a lot of fish that you would find like nestled within the floor of the thing, much like the Yeti crab. Benthic, thank you. So just another quick look at just a slightly closer look at all these different Yeti crabs. You can see they all have different hairs too. Like this guy has some on his legs. This one has them. They're all underneath. This one I believe is also underneath. And what I do remember learning is that the color of the shell also determines like which region of the world they're from. I don't have a ton more info on that. But that is just something that I thought was interesting, and I thought I wanted to kind of highlight these guys just a little bit more. But what I do want to spend a little bit more time on, because you were like, okay, that's cool. How do these tie in? Like, how do these tie into 14 more than just, being weird looking bottom dwelling hydrothermal vent, not lobsters? And it's that the Maru crab actually has a parallel to real world cultures as well. Both the Yeti crab and the Maru crab are named after an ocean deity. So we have Maru, which is the deity of water, for the first. That is about as much information as I could find on that. There was a surprising little amount of information that I could easily find on the deities of the first, especially the Ando. And then Kiwa, which, if you remember, the name, the scientific name for Yeti crab started with Kiwa. If you go to Polynesian beliefs and lore and mythology, Kiwa is the name of the god of the ocean. So both of these crabs are named after ocean deities. Like they're very same. This is a very clear cut parallel of like this is what they were fully intending to do. And that was something that I thought was very interesting, and it was a very nice nod, I think, to that real world culture. That they're based on they're not just basing it like scientifically or like the region. They're actually taking the region and or looking at real world cultures and including that as well with those facts that I was talking about. And there are so many other fish in the real world that are based on deities, and I can't really list them all because there was no comprehensive list, but there is so many different fish that are named after some form of deity, and some, like one fish could have like 3 different names based on where it is, all of them tied to a different deity. So I don't have a huge list on that, but in 14 there is a handful of fish that are also based on various deities. We have from the first, we have Caliban, we have Oscan's print. This is from top left to right, and moving across. We have Nemia's wheel, not Henotus grandis. I noticed some people were panicking during the panel, so breathe. This is Nemia's wheel. This isn't Henotus grandis. Navigator's dagger in the lower left. We have Star of the Destroyer, obviously based off of Ralgar. And then we have on the lower right, we have this fish that is one of those few fish that are not a one-to-one copy of a real-life fish. This is the unconditional. It is a representation of the Dusk Mother and Dawn Father. And this is one of those fish that actually we don't know, or we can't find a real-life one-to-one example of it. You'll look at it, and as somebody pointed out after I gave my panel, was like, isn't that just a beta fish? And the answer is yes. It is very clearly based off of a beta fish. However, the morphology of the tail is not one that we typically see in real life. The tail is very clearly meant to be based on a like a sun and a moon, which would be the Dusk Mother and Dawn Father. And so that was kind of like a creative alteration that we made, and that's one of those few fish that we don't really have a real life equivalent to it. All right, so moving into other completely weird fish, let's talk about Olgoi Korkoi. Now, Olgoi Korkoi is caught in Thanalan. It is also a name that you would maybe find on a Lalafell, but this is what it looks like in game. Is this based off of a real life fish? I will also extend this to say, is this based off of a real life creature? There was for those who are not in chat right now, there was a notable pause between before getting an answer. And I'm not getting a lot of them. And so I'm going to move on. And the answer is technically we don't know. We're not sure if it is. Maybe it might be. So Olgoi Korkoi is actually a name that comes from the Mongolian, from a Mongolian piece of, I want to say, mythology, and it is named after a cryptid, and it is, or mythological creature, you can kind of decide however you want to call it, but it is based off of technically the Mongolian death worm. Now, there's a lot of different ways that this could go, but I wanted to start with in Final Fantasy XIV, there are at least 4 fish that share the same look. And typically when we see fish that share the same look, it's within species. So like all trout are based off the same trout. Like Icon, they might have some color changes, they might have some pattern changes, but they're all very clearly the same type of trout. Same thing with bass. Eels, all the eels look very similar, just different colors to match them. But all of these guys, there's only 4 of them. And from left to right, we have the Olgoi Korkoi, we have Shrieker, and then we have the Chlorophos Deathworm and the Lunar Deathworm. Shrieker you can actually put into a tank, which is kind of fun. But for some odd reason in game, these are all classified as like mollusks and are also based, are all related somehow. The Chlorophos Deathworm and the Lunar Deathworm, there's also the Deathworm name coming in, which was also like another hint / clue, like, hey, maybe this is based on this. We have the lore from the Chlorophos Deathworm and Lunar Deathworm basically saying that they might have been like ancestors that got struck down to Eorzean and on Earth, creating the Olgoi Korkoi and the Shrieker. But more importantly, we have a description of what the Mongolian Deathworm works. So that was a bit of a 14 tangent. We're going to go back to the real world here. And it is, and I quote, "It is shaped like a sausage, about 2 feet long, has no head nor legs, and it is so poisonous that merely to touch it means instant death. It lives in the most desolate parts of the Gobi Desert." And I know for everybody who's watching at home, you're all like, well, the Gobi Desert, like Gobi already means desert, so it doesn't have to be it twice. I'm just quoting the guy, all right? Don't yell at me. But this is from this is a quote from the Mongolian Prime Minister Damdinbazar in 1922, and it was from a book by Roy Chapman Andrew called On the Trail of Ancient Man. Fun fact, you can actually go and read this book. You can still get copies of it. And it has a 4.3 out of 5 on Goodreads. So we have this weird creature here, and so naturally everyone's like, well, we have to find it now. And so people searched the Gobi Desert, and nobody found it. Nobody found anything that matched a description of what the Mongolian Deathworm would look like at all. And there was a lot of different expeditions to the Gobi to find it. Some of my favorite highlights for this one was that one guy tried to summon it like a dune sandworm. He even developed his own thumper. If you know Dune, sandworms are drawn to rhythmic pounding, and so he developed. This guy developed his own little thumper that you would put into the sand, and you see this in the books and in the movie. Developed his own that would, rhythmically pound the desert to try and summon it. He tried small explosives. He didn't find it, and this was like in 1990 and 92. He was very inspired by Dune for this one. Another guy couldn't find it and claimed that it was apocryphal and that it was just an unknown species of Amphisbaenia, which Amphisbaenia is ironically, well, maybe not ironically, but it is a species of worm lizard, which is these little guys, which are like lizard worm things. They have little feet. They're kind of weird. I didn't come more prepared than with this really cute picture of them, but highly recommend checking them out. It's also kind of ironic that he said like, oh, it's apocryphal, and it's like just this unknown species of Amphisbaenia, because Amphisbaenia is also the name of another mythical creature that was also a lizard that had 2 heads, not like Hydra, but more like, if you know Cat Dog, where it was like there was a head at that where you'd think the head would be, and then there would be a head at where you'd suspect the tail to be. So that was kind of a bit weird. I am going to say now, I am going to briefly show a picture of a snake for this next one. So if you are not a fan of a snake, tab out. I will tell you when it is safe to come back. Okay, we are going to go look at a snake really quick. This is what was when shown a picture to some locals of different local creatures, people who said that they have seen the Mongolian deathworm claimed that this is what it was. This is a Tartar sand boa, and it is likely the original inspiration for the creature. And these guys, I mean, they're desert based. They live in the Gobi. It kind of lines up. They're kind of spooky. So this is kind of currently where people are like, this is what Olgoi Korkoi are. And something I totally forgot to mention, the name Olgoi Korkoi came from a book. It wasn't actually Mongolian. And I'm going to look that up really quick so I don't get that wrong. See, this is the one nice thing about doing this from home, is that I can quickly Google. So yeah, so Olgoi Korkoi is a local name for the cryptid of the Mongolian deathworm, but Olgoi Korkoi was also a short story by a author by an author named Ivan Wefremov, who was Soviet, and this would have been back in like the mid 1900s, something like that. Yeah, something like that. But it was based on the story from based on just travel through Mongolia, so it's all coming from the same thing. But okay, we are going to be moving off of the snake. Snake is no longer on the screen. You are welcome to come back. So, we've just talked about a whole bunch of mythical stuff that may or may not exist. So let's talk about things that actually do exist. Sea monsters. Final Fantasy XIV has their own set of sea monsters. We have Octomammoth here in the upper left and Kraken down in the lower right. Octomammoth caught, this guy is from the Aether Font, final boss. And then in the lower right, that's Hullbreaker Isle. And they do have their own 14 equivalents, where Octomammoth is caught in Limsa. However, there isn't really much of a relation between the one in the Aether Font or the boss from, I believe, Final Fantasy VIII, and the actual fish. They liked the name, but the one for Hullbreaker Isle for Kraken, that's Hefgufa in the lower left-hand corner. That is a fabled legend. There is actually lore to imply that Hefgufa is the Final Fantasy IV. Thank you. There is Hefgufa is implied to be a descendant of the Hullbreaker Isle boss, which I thought was a neat little tool of like narrative. But all throughout human history, we also have our own sea monsters. On the left, we have, this is from Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which should be noted that 20,000 leagues is a distance, not depth. So they just spent 20,000 continuous leagues traveling around underwater rather than depth. That's a giant squid, though, from the book. On the right-hand side, we have this other weird serpentine-like fish. And one of the things that with these sea creatures throughout history, they've all been found to be real. Like mermaids were originally one of the big mythical sea creatures. A lot of people just found them out to be dugongs or manatees. On the left-hand side here, we have an image, like I said, from Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. That's a giant squid. It ended up just being the Humboldt squid. That was kind of the basis for what this was actually based on. And the Humboldt squid is a rather large squid. It's not the largest squid. There was the giant squid, which is slightly larger, and then there's a colossal squid, which we actually haven't found yet, but we know it exists. Giant squid are huge. I don't remember the size off the top of my head, but the colossal squid is even larger, and it is currently unseen. We haven't seen it because it lives in very deep water, very dark water, very cold water, and all those things really don't work for robots and cameras, and they're very elusive. But we do know they exist because them and I believe blue or sperm whales uh, basically feed on each other. And we find that in whale stomachs, we find parts of the colossal squid. So we know what parts of it look like. We know like its tentacle suckers are more like razor claw-like rather than the giant squid, which is more like serrated. And we have a rough size of it, which is big. But that's just one of those sea monsters that we haven't actually found yet. But a lot of sea monsters we have found. Like this guy on the right. Does anybody know what this guy on the right is? Because we get a little bit more. And if you're not sure, this was considered one of the first sea serpents in all of mythology. These guys were kind of weird, and they were sighted in deep waters across the globe, not just a single region. Typically, you'll hear about oarfish in Asian mythology, but they are found all over the world. I think they're even in the Mediterranean, which was a big surprise to me. But these guys are the oarfish, as I accidentally totally slipped there. And in Japanese legend, I want everyone to remember this. In Japanese legend, oarfish are called the messengers from the dragon god's palace. Sighting one is usually a sign of something bad, typically of an upcoming earthquake or tsunami. A lot of people joke that seeing an oarfish is the equivalent of seeing an upcoming apocalypse, which sucks. But these guys live deep, like deep underwater, and usually when they're spotted, it's when they're dead, because they are the theory that I believe most people run with is that the oarfish are so deep down that if there is any sort of tectonic movement, they're very sensitive to that. It disrupts them. They effectively die. They float up, and people go, "Oh, there's an oarfish. There must have been some tectonic activity. Something's happening. We need to, we need to actually prepare ourselves." And so seeing one, at least in Japanese legend, wasn't a good thing. Though I also wanted to include this image because it is the cutest picture of an oarfish that I have found. I know it's a complete tonal shift there, but I just looked like a little seal with eels and stuff. But also to point out, in the lower left here, you'll see part of the tip of the oarfish is cut off. You'll actually find that a lot of oarfish are missing parts of them because some fish will attempt to eat them. And so I thought that was very interesting that this person included that. Usually when you see sea serpents or any sort of sea monsters, they don't have parts missing. They're so dominant that they're represented as whole and infallible and impossible to damage. So I thought it was very interesting that this one particularly was missing a tail. So in Final Fantasy XIV, we have a couple of oarfish, and this one is Little Paracos. The one that I wanted to highlight specifically was Little Paracos. We have Little Thalos, which is another oarfish, and these two guys are caught right across from each other. I think they share. I think you can catch Little Thalos also in the at the same place you can catch Little Paracos, but they're both in Eastern Lenosha, just off the coast of the Isle of Endless Summer, between where the Moonfire Fair takes place and the Privateer, and they're oarfish, and this is what they look like. They swim vertically for the most part. They can be relatively small. I have seen them. Images of oarfish that are maybe 1.5 feet long and 2 inches wide, and I've seen some that are 33 feet long. Oarfish are the longest bony fish in the ocean, from what I have read, and they are absolutely, uh, rare. Since 19, let me get my math right here. Since 1901, there has been 20 live sightings of oarfish. There's been a bunch of other dead sightings, but there's only been about 20 sightings of these guys. And before anyone asks or is curious, yes, a lot of those sightings have coincided with the rise of cell phones and uh, better picture quality and like just better camera tech. Um, so just a fun little side fact on that one. But these guys swim vertically and are considered harbingers of the apocalypse. Typically tsunamis, which are large walls of water, and the names and the representation is not at all an accident. Um, so the fact that little Thalos and little Pericos are represented as oarfish is not unintentional. Thalos and Pericos, if you have done anything with the Endwalker Alliance raid, or if you have read the Eorzean creation myth before that, you know that Lemlian had her twin pet serpents, Pericos and Thalios, brought water to the worlds. Basically, in the story, Lemlian shows up, saw that the world was bare, and was like, that's not cool, and then summoned Pericos and Thalios, and they just brought water everywhere, akin to a tsunami and rising waters and stuff like that. And so the fact that they are oarfish, at least by icon, visually you look at that and you're like, that's not an oarfish, and you would be right. But they are very, very much based off of oarfish, and they are very much based off of that Japanese portion of the legend of oarfish, that they are bringers of earthquakes and tsunamis and of high waters, basically. And yes, and they're messengers of the sea deity, as someone in chat is pointing out, as Aga pointed out, which is Lemlian. She is the navigator. She is the goddess of the oceans. So it's this very interesting and very fun little parallel. So that once we knew this going in to the final fight, like we being fishers, knew this going into the final A Realm Reborn fight, that there was a very, 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 very high chance that we would be fighting Pericos and Thalios. And so when we finally got to see them represented in game, very, very, very exciting. Another fun little side fact too about little Pericos and Thalios in game is little Thalios. You find during the Feast of Famine quest line will sometimes, and this is like one, maybe two Thalios per calamity, will somehow, presumptively due to excess aether, engorge itself and become a Nepto dragon. So if you've ever done like the Feast of Famine questline, you have to catch a Nepto dragon, you're technically catching a little Thalios, which is also the intuition trigger for a Nepto dragon. There's also a further, and this isn't as really confirmed, this is more of like looking around the outside and looking at the way that they've kind of painted this in Outer Lenosha, I believe, to the west of Bronze Lake. You'll see a section called Thalios, and there's a giant serpent skeleton, and there is a Lalafell there who gives you a short quest and tells you about the skeleton and how they think that it is Lemlian's deity of Thalios. But if you look in between the lines a little bit and you look back and consider where it is and what it is, there's actually a non-zero chance that the Thalios is actually a Nepto dragon from the Sixth Umbral Calamity, which was the calamity of water, and basically because we knew that Nepto dragons showed up during and after a calamity, and we knew that it is tied, their appearance is tied to an aether, or tied to aether, and that we know that it is a little Thalios that gets engorged because of that. When you have a water calamity and you're a fish, you're going to have a real good time. And so the Nepto dragon probably just became massive and huge. And so the creation myth probably got a little bit stronger during the Sixth Umbral Calamity because everyone's like, oh, Lemurian would bring these pets that would bring the waters. Suddenly, all these waters show up. And then you see this massive dragon that looked like this massive sea serpent swimming around. Yeah, you might think that that's going to be Thalios. So that was something, just a bit of a side tangent that I thought was really interesting. And I thought that the representation of Thalios and Pericos in Final Fantasy XIV as Oarfish was absolutely like the most perfect representation of fish that we have between not just the real world and the lore and the myth around those fish, but also in game. And that parallel is like so rock solid. I just wanted to highlight them. So anyways, kind of in conclusion, I just wanted to make it very, if you weren't sure, most fish in Final Fantasy XIV are based on real life species, either past or present. There's 1,707 fish in the guide alone, plus more outside of that. And they all have their own stories to tell, not just about the world of Final Fantasy and the world of Final Fantasy XIV and the cultures around them, but also the real world as well. So that was my panel. We have time for questions. If anyone has questions, you can either drop them in chat right now, or if you're watching in the future, please drop them in the comments below. So if you have any questions in chat, I will give you a minute or so, a little less, to get there as I get a drink of water. So bear with me one sec. Okay. Any questions? One last time here. Okay, so Rose Artemis is asking, do you have a favorite real-life fish that is not yet represented in the game? Crap, I didn't think of this one. I went through like all the variants of what is your favorite fish, and this is one that I haven't come up with yet. We don't really have a whale shark yet. As I talked about, like Problematicus is not a whale shark. But also, I don't think we want or need one. There's a handful of fish in Final Fantasy XIV that we've obviously been through their biomes, but they aren't represented at all. Like, you can't catch like blue whale, you can't catch sperm whale, you can't catch dolphins, you can't catch. I mean, there's actually a ton of sharks that we can't actually catch right now. And I think that there's some that they're choosing not to include, like also sea turtles. That's the other big one. I think that there is a lot of fish that I would love to see, but also I don't think should be represented because they are either endangered, and I don't want to see endangered fish getting represented as like things that you could just go out and catch, because a lot of people will look at fish in will look at fishing in 14 and go, hey, this is kind of fun, and then they'll start fishing in real life. I'm totally not saying that just because that's what happened to me, but you really don't want to necessarily be promoting like the fishing of these either rare or endangered fish. So there's a lot that I would love to see, but I also think we just also shouldn't get at all, and why we don't see some fish as well. And also, yeah, so chat's also pointing out we don't have any clownfish. We don't have a whale shark. We don't have any blue tangs. I don't think we have a nurse shark. Um, there's uh, I think also something else worth mentioning is that some digital representation of endangered creatures is protected. Weirdly, I recall that like this isn't a fish obviously, but like panda bears are for a while at least were digitally protected, where if a game was going to include a panda bear, it couldn't be put into like any harm or any battle, so they were very neutral creatures. I believe that was one case, or like that was like a very strong recommendation. Um, and then there's also a bunch of other fish too that are just very difficult to uh, very difficult to catch in the first place, so it wouldn't make sense that you could catch them. The chat right now I know is talking about paddlefish. Paddlefish are one of those fish that you can't you don't catch them like normal fish. Like with normal fish, you would throw out like a lure. Like if I'm going for bass, I'll throw out a lure and reel it in. The bass will attack it and eat it, and that's how you catch the fish. Paddlefish don't do that. Paddlefish are just they just swim around with their mouth open and they're just like and suck up whatever they can get. They don't care about bait really all that much. So you have to catch them with something called snagging, which is slightly different than how it's represented in game, but a very similar concept where you just have a line of a bunch of hooks, you cast it out, and then you just reel that in and hope that you catch onto one of them, and you do something called foul hooking. So you'll end up catching paddlefish not just in their mouth, but on their tails, on their side, on their fins. That is regulated, I believe, at least in the southern U.S. specifically. I was watching a video on that as part of the prep for this presentation. So we also didn't get any paddlefish until Endwalker, and we didn't get any like true paddlefish until Dawntrail, which I thought was interesting as well. So I think there's a lot of fish that I would love to see, but you just also wouldn't expect to be catching them in real life. The myth, and I don't know how real this myth is. I say myth, but really it's like a myth within the fishing community. Is that the developer of fishing, or as we lovingly call Fisher Dev, is an active fisher. And the story goes that they are actively fishing, and one day, many, many years ago, they took Soken, the composer, out onto the Sea of Japan to go fish. Which is why we kind of think that fishing is the way it is, not just because it was designed to be a very slow and methodical activity that really help people interact with the world in a different way, but also because the developer of it is an active fisher, and so they were just like, we're gonna do it this way. Okay. Any other questions? Let me skim through here really quick. I'm not seeing any other questions come up, so I will say thank you. If anyone has any more questions, you can post them on the VOD's comments, or you can just DM me later. So thank you everyone for listening to my panel again, or for the first time. So good luck, and have a wonderful rest of your day, week, month, year, or whatever time frame that you wish to have luck for. You may have it.